Now we move on to Section 2, Economic Growth, Measurements, and Forecasts. You must ask, why is it that in an organizational behavior class we're looking at economic numbers? Well, a firm does business in this global world. So what happens with the economy impacts how a company operates. This slide here, which is from McKinsey, is they surveyed what they call advanced industries, other industries, and overall, asking about what aspects of the business will be positive, what will be negative. And what we see for advanced industries versus others, that there's sort of a little more negativity here, but let's just look at communication with employees is up, very positive things. This is part of organizational behavior. Company's purpose, up, part of OB. Company's culture, up. Ability to drive execution and accountability at the front level, neither. Ability to make decisions quickly, productivity has dropped. Ability to meet the needs of the stakeholders, stability. So these are all things that are impacted by what's going in the economy today, and they have an impact. So management is going to be reacting to these changes, and this all impacts what's happening with the company and how they behave. So the first thing we're going to do, some of this should be repetitive for you, is the GDP. It's just a simple indicator of a country's economic health. If it's healthy growing, we got low unemployment, wages are increased as business demand labor to meet growing economy, and it builds confidence. If growing too fast, inflation can be a risk. Negative growth, and that's defined, we have less jobs, less productions, and we don't feel good. You can see that what happened in the past few months. 2 quarters of negative growth is a recession, so we are technically in a recession right now. When we look at it, though, it's total, and it's often expressed as a comparison on a percentage basis to prior year or quarter. Trends over time are more important because there can be one-time events that can skew the number, if you will. It's very complicated, and it includes other statistics and estimates. It doesn't pick up everything. It's also not timely that we get a preliminary and a final or revised. They call it a first look, second look. So this one here, the purpose of this basically is so you can get a relative feel of what the size is. The last revision, as you can see here, is August of 20. And the next date will come out on the 30th. But what we can see, the total GDP, this is what the U.S. economy produces, is about $19.5 trillion. Now, there was a big drop, but let's look at the components that make up the GDP. It's based on personal consumer expenditures, the gross private domestic investment, what are companies doing to invest in the future, net exports, and government spending. So what we can see here is the drop came primarily in personal consumption. We spent less. And we spent less between the fourth quarter and the first quarter. Now think about when this happened. This happened in mid-March that we sort of went into hiatus. But then we see the full impact here. We're just starting to come out. So we've seen spending increase. Companies spent less. Governments essentially flat. They continued to spend. Now, when we start to see the impact of the COVID-19 CARES Act, we'll start to see a different impact of that. I went back all the way to 1947, and I prepared this graph to show you what's happening since 1947. And as you can see, the decline that we just suffered, both in the first and the second quarter, is the biggest decline that we have ever had. Here is the Great Recession. Here was our recession when we went into 1979, 1980. We had interest rates running around 20%, but the economy slowed. But you can see over time we've had growth. But this is just to give you a proportion of what's happening. That means companies are selling less, which means they have to change what they do. A lot of that evolves around employees. And just to give you a sense under current period, we can see that we've been averaging somewhere between 2.5 to 3. We haven't had a real growth. So if we go back and look, there's times that we were growing at 5, 10%, but in the past 3-4 years, we've been relatively flat, and then we see the decline. So if you were to add up all of these, we've probably given up all of the gains we've had since 2016. Now, this is the first time that people are spending less than they have since 2010, the impact of the Great Recession. So that's getting in the way, if you will. So now, and this is it constantly forecasting what is the economic growth under a couple scenarios. So if we leave August or January of 20 at 102 and we follow it through, and this is a base forecast, and this comes from the Conference Board, and here's the best case, upside, downtime, the previous one. So what they're looking for is about between 3.3 minus 7 for the annual growth in 2020, 4.9. Then when we move into 21, between 1 and 4 with 2. Now, that's based on a lot of assumptions, but we're going to assume that the current year is going to be negative, and it won't be until next year that on a year-on-year basis we are positive. Now, if we look at this, this is the global economy, how much is produced by the different countries. So what we can see is the U.S. produces about 24% of the world's economy, with China following up at 14.85, and the rest spreading out. And so now, when we look at what is happening globally, we just looked at what the U.S. was going to do, and we can see it's somewhere, this one is different organization, but same range, within the range, and we see what's happening in Europe, Middle East, emerging, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa. So what we see is that emerging and developing Asia, which is China, is actually growing versus a reduction in these areas. Sub-Saharan Africa, which is growing rapidly, is that, and we come out with a world of about a -3 and a recovery next year. But look at where the recovery is going to happen. Recovery is happening in Asia. Okay? And when we look at what contributed to growth, we can see that a lot of the global growth has come from China, as we can see here. And the U.S. has contributed very little. So there is growth in China. So now we take trends that we've talked about, people, production, and what we can see is that by the year 2050, China and India will exceed the GDP of the U.S., and the U.S. will become a smaller part. But think about that within the context of the number of people. So we can engage in different policy things, but you can't stop some of this momentum because it's based on people and size. And I think, as I said before, the only way this is going to turn around if people in your age group start getting married when you're 20, 21, and you have 5 to 6 kids. So you sort of have to say, are you going to do that? And I think I know the answer, but think about that for a second. We are slowing population growth, and therefore our economy was slow, simply because we don't have the resources of people. We need to be cautious on using the GDP. It reflects what's happened in the past. It doesn't fully capture the impact of technology, changes in lifestyle. There's a lot of other things that go in besides economic, environmental, social indicators. So that's our GDP look. More information and ability to measure growth in real times and crowdsourcing information is changing our understanding. It's happening so quickly. So businesses is trying to adapt to how do we use all that information. Let's take a look at the unemployment situation and the labor situation. These come out on the first Friday of the month, so there will be a new one this Friday on the 4th. But as of July, we're looking at about a 10.2% unemployment, which we can see that did drop from where we were in June as people are returning to work. But still, 10% if you look at it, this is the largest number. I only went back to 1990. In the Great Recession, we only hit 10%, and then we declined after that. But we can't look at that number of 10% and say, oh, it's getting better. We have to consider two other things. The first thing is, look what happened. These jobs that were created were part-time for economic reasons. So they're counted as employed, but if you look at where we started, we went from 4 to, we're now at 9 million. So 5 million of the jobs created and included in that number are part-time, okay, because they can't find real jobs. You got to look at the headline and go deeper. This is the critical thinking that I've been talking about. The other thing we got to look at is the labor force participation rate. And this chart, you can see that we only have about 60% of the population in the workforce. So if we look at what happened here, we went from almost 63% down to 60. So let's just say 3%. Well, 3% of the American population is 18 million people. So 18 million people left the workforce. So if we go back here, this rate is computed on how many people are here. So yes, it looks like employment got better, but you got to take into account the 18 million people who left the workforce. So the number of people not working has increased. Now, when we look at this alternative measures, what we see is the unemployment rate, when you make adjustments for all of that, is we're probably 20 to 25% unemployment or underemployed right now. That's a very serious problem when you think of economic growth. So now what is a company going to do? I want to just comment on college education. You're here and you're learning all this great stuff. And a 4-year degree or higher, when I graduated from college in 1977, that was a few years ago, about 34% of Americans had a 4-year degree. Okay? Today, only 38%. So since 1977, the number of educated Americans has only gone up by 4%. And by states, that varies from 28 to 50%. In New York, it's over 50%. Okay? But we have a lot of states that are barely moved. Let's look at other countries. Canada now has 56% of the population with a 4-year degree. Japan, 51. Israel, 50. Korea, 47. So what we're seeing is that the number of people, percentage of population that has a 4-year degree and is able to work in higher level jobs has grown immensely. Has not grown. But the good news for you guys is that when you look at it over time, those with the 4-year degree and higher have a much lower unemployment rate going back to 1992 to 20, that 30-year period, than anyone else. The ones in trouble are those that have no high school diploma, and that number is pretty stark. So that's sort of our picture of that, but I want to introduce something, and this becomes important from how a workforce operates. And it's entitled, Meet the Low-Wage Workforce. And this number scares me. And I think it should scare you too from a long-term view of our country. They define low-wage workers, and when we start looking at that, what the median annual earnings are. $17,953, $10.22 an hour. Anybody make more than that on their summer jobs? But look at that, 43.7%. That's about 53 million people are low-wage workers, okay? Most of them in the younger group, but still in the older group. Then move on to the mid and high, 56, 54. Look at that gap, okay? And this can lead to a lot of different things, how companies operate. But think about it from some of the social unrest that we're seeing now. This gap has grown. If we go from 1970 to 28, when we look at the top tiers of who make how income and transferring, which is payments from the government, how they've changed. So if you're in the bottom 50%, Okay, you might have had 19,640 in 1970, and it's 27,642 now. So that's a 41% increase. Sounds good, right? Let's keep breaking it down. For those to 50 to 90, oh, it was a 72% increase. For the top 10%, 105. Top 1%, 250. The top 1/10%, 412. Top 0.01, 555. So just look at what happened here. The amount of growth that's happened is up here. This wage distribution. Think about this from the behavioral perspective. So we don't want to forget that. And of course, the job losses, where were they? Low-income workers. That's putting more pressure on those. So that sort of summarizes up that. If you got any questions, please let me know.